Hello, Internet, if that is indeed your real name. So, what I wanted to do was take a minute and do something a little different. I wanted to talk about some different associations I have with different characters. Mainstream stuff mostly, just because that's where I think this works. Just quick little things about how I consider some different characters and interpretations that might just be mine or are particular to me in some way. So I just wanted to run through it and just try to create something, just kind of an idea around some of this that maybe will get you guys thinking about how you think of some of these characters. So, sorry, just got interrupted twice in a row. An obvious example to me is Superman. A big reason why I like him that gets over the obvious problem that people have with him, and this one's more journalist than the other ones I'm thinking, is Superman's interesting because despite being virtuous and good and whatnot, that doesn't mean he's boring. Good can be interesting. Good should be interesting. It's very akin to the reason why I like Star Trek or Doctor Who or a lot of other sci-fi things. It's appealing to what's good and what's right, and that should be motivating, wanting you to press forward. And that idea, that kernel, is something that always attracts me to a certain character or story or whatever. And I think is where a lot of the crazy sci-fi stuff goes, because it takes us to where, when what's possible is expanded, what do we choose to do? What do we do with it? And that makes for more interesting choices instead of limiting our possibility, making the most of dire situations, which is where I feel more popular storytelling is these days. The idea of looking at the possibility with what's available to us is more interesting, because I feel like that's more valuable storytelling. And right now, the Superman run or older Superman runs I think works well. What's interesting to me is there's no like creator or arc or anything I'd really point to with Superman. It's much more about the idea and enjoying it throughout the ages and how it just kind of stands tall. So that's a bit about Superman that I lock into. Almost alternately, when I think Iron Man, I really key into the Matt Fraction run, the Invincible Iron Man. And I don't have many positive associations with it. I remember the first handful of issues being really interesting, playing around with the armor and the ideas of what was going on with that. But a lot of it, I remember being a very pale knockoff of later Wildcats comics. And so, in my mind, I always associate Iron Man with being kind of a knockoff, even though that makes no sense in the grander scheme of things. That's where my mind first jumps to when I think of Iron Man. And that's just, I imagine that's just me. Then there's some slightly more personal ones that I think you guys could relate to, and I think of the Green Arrow. I always jump back to the Winnick run because I sat down and read it, and that's when I kind of really started enjoying Green Arrow. I'd read a little bit before, read the Kevin Smith stuff, and read a little bit about him in some other situations. Some people really like the Grell stuff, and I'd been pushed to read that, and I still haven't, access being something of an issue. But the Winnick run, I sat down and I read because I was able to procure it really cheap a few years ago. But what pushed me to be interested in it was Travis, Oddfellow's thoughts. And so as I was reading, I immediately knew I had someone to talk to about it. And it really just keyed me in. And to me, like, that is the Green Arrow. And it's funny because at this point, there had been the Arrow show. The comics had long since moved on. There'd been, I think, a couple interpretations of Green Arrow that were drastically different. But to me, that's what Green Arrow is. And it's interesting because by the time I arrived on that Green Arrow is already gone. And at this point, I don't think he's ever coming back. So, different kind of interpretation there as well. And then there's some older stuff. There's few characters that I've read as relatively prolifically as I have Deadpool. And to me, there's kind of two Deadpools, and it's funny because they bookended the. It's technically the third volume, but the original run. Um, Joe Kelly's take on Deadpool, and then Gail Simone's take on Deadpool, which, when you break them down, are actually fairly different characters. Joe Kelly's is this true anti-hero, this tortured soul trying to make sense of things, but just failing and trying to become a hero, but on some level knowing he never can be. And Gail Simone's is this mercenary who lucks into making it big and is just going through and dealing with these heightened circumstances that he stumbled into. And it's actually much more of a classical comedy with all this crazy action superhero stuff going on the side. Um, to me, these are like the two main points of Deadpool. Since then, obviously, it's been tons of different interpretations and takes. Um, some met with more success than others, and usually to an inverse proportion to how well they're written. Uh, but there are few comics that I've read more than I have read Joe Kelly and Gail Simone's runs on Deadpool. And so, like, no matter what, those will always be, because, I mean, I'll never probably reread anything the amount of times I've read those comics. They stay with me. I have portions of them memorized and referenced, and part of my development in thinking about how things are written and read. You can't take that out of you. So, yeah, so my associations with Deadpool are very much set, and is a character that, now that we've pretty much moved beyond that understanding, is a character I just don't find much interest in anymore. Then here's another odd one. The Sandman, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, not the guy with the gas canister, though interestingly that ties in. My first interpretation, the way I understood the character for years, because I never picked up the Sandman proper, and you think of it now, was actually a crossover title between the two characters, which the idea that there were two Sandman was like this thing I was trying to figure out in my head at the time, because I had no context for it on either side. And to me, Morpheus, being this character, was a god trapped inside a bottle, essentially. I mean, glass enclosure. But the idea of that this, like, imprisoned god, like, that threw me through a loop, like, because he's not even technically a god, he's beyond that, but yeah, it doesn't really come up in the comic that I read as a kid. And so this idea of this imprisoned entity, this imprisoned god, is kind of where my mind always springboards from when I think of that character, and seeing what he can do and what he's capable of. I always sometimes come back to, but he was imprisoned. How? If he can do all of this, how does iron and concrete hold him back? And that's not really the case, but it's something that ticks in my memory, and I have to remember all this other stuff about what I've read about the character since then, but that always is something that I tick to when I think about that character in a number of ways. Another character that I have a particular tick to, though this one is actually in canon, essentially, is Spider-Man. And I have loved Spider-Man across many eras. I mean, I'm going back and reading some with Sleeping Out. We need to get back to that. And there's all these different, takes and interpretations. But there was a period where I was physically and literally through the mail subscribing to Spider-Man. It was a very particular moment. I remember because initially the first issue that I got, I was super confused because it was just a black cover. It was the 2001 issue, and what a way to start. But not too long after that, you're dealing with Ezekiel and JMS's cast and run of Spider-Man, which was standout for good and ill. Not to get too far into that, But there's one line that always kind of hit me. There were a few in that run, actually, but the one that always kind of hit me that made me think about Spider-Man differently, and I've never been able to shake it since, was someone pointing out, you have a slight Brooklyn accent. It's like, you don't see that in the movie interpretations, you don't really see those in the cartoons, but yeah, the idea that, yeah, he's a guy that grew up in Queens, he's going to have a bit of an accent, you know, and the idea of, like, trying to read Spider-Man dialogue with this, you know, bit, you know, not a super thick, but like a bit of an accent, it just always was like, oh yeah, and something about that just cemented to me in the fact that he was a teacher at the time, teaching there. Like, there are hundreds of characters that are based in New York. And if you place them and kind of just gave them a block and you put them in another city, it wouldn't matter as much. But there is something just purely about Spider-Man that I don't think works if you take him outside of New York in any ways. Like, if you put Daredevil and put him in Chicago, I don't think it would be too far off, right? You know, you take the Baxter Building, the Fantastic Four, place it anywhere. It's more or less fine. Thor, who cares, you know? I mean, all this, but Spider-Man, you take him out of New York and something doesn't work, and they've actually played with that in a handful of comics, and just that whole idea really clicked, and it was kind of refined too, because I read that bit, and then I was on a trip to New York, and just kind of thinking about the people there, and thinking about how they talked, and I'm like, okay, and just looking at the scale of, you know, New York City, and comparing it to not, which is where I live, just something about, like, the web swinging, and the idea of him moving around, and what he could do, like, it works there, it doesn't work elsewhere. It's just one of those things that definitely clicked with me about Spider-Man. And it's always that JMS run that I feel colored Spider-Man in a way that made sense that very few other creators have done. I feel like I have to tackle the big boy here. So, Batman is a character that I actually don't have a specific thought of. He's a character that I feel more so than nearly any other character. You can kind of write him in a different way, in a different mode, in a different thing, treat him completely differently, and it's fine now because he's been so all over the map with everything that who cares? It's Batman, and do we need to explore Batman anymore? No, that's been done to death too. Like, it's just the most character. I don't know. So, Hellblazer, comic I need to get back to. The Family Man story arc is something that I think really hit me. And something about it, like, Constantine's this character that's always getting out of scrapes and getting by, doing whatever. But in Family Man, it showed, like, you take him out of his element, you take away the magic and playing in this certain world where he knows the players and he kind of knows the rules where there aren't rules. And he's just kind of a guy who's an ass. And you take that away from him and he has about nothing. And him dealing with what most other characters deal with in the DC is something he's not equipped for at all. It was just like taking this fairly renowned character and showing just how, like, relatively weak he can be was something that hit me. Along those lines, Books of Magic, Kid in There, whoop, came before Harry Potter. I'll always come to that first. I don't know why. I'm just like, this is what Harry Potter ripped off. Okay. So, the Black Panther is a character that I've always taken as the idea of, like, if there was a good king. He's actually in the fray, he's in the action. He's a character that's more viewed by others than ever needs to be viewed by himself, as seen in the Priest run, where it's basically never from T'Challa's point of view. And that whole idea just made it work for me. Because, I mean, a king, as noble and amazing as that character is, tales are really told by other people. The king's just going from situation to situation, using all the information to do what he can for his people. And something about that really worked. It was kind of, in a weird way, made me think of King Arthur in particular in a way that other superhero comics don't. And it's kind of funny to me that Black Panther's maybe in some ways the closest thing to that we get. And I know there's some straight allusions to King Arthur, but I think they're more or less lost by the time we get to the 2000s Marvel and DC comics. So, Concrete is an interesting indie story that I know a lot of people have a lot of love for. But where Concrete lost me was when they get to Hollywood and there's all this reverence and talk, for old school Hollywood, and this is how movies work behind the scenes and all this intricate knowledge of movies. I'm like, you know what? This is a goddamn comic. Who cares about movies? I care about comics. And just that, it felt like kind of a betrayal coming from this renowned indie comic that is revering movies. There's a tension between comic lovers and movie lovers, and it's conflated now, but something about that, in that comic in particular, always kind of felt like a betrayal to me. So that's part of the reason I've never had a ton of love for Concrete. Here's a weird one too. Ghost in the Shell, the original set, not 1.5 or 2. I'm always going to be missing, because I had a chance to get it too. There's a printing that has or most printings that you'll find have a page that's been taken out, and it's just one page, and they just lift it front and back, where the Major and some girls are just on a boat, and it's nudity, whatever, and it's actually relatively important to the plot and plays to the idea that the Major was not a girl before being put into the shell. So, interesting. I don't know, just the idea that there's most printings in America just do not have that page is just one of the few things I always key into when I see a printing of that. So, right now, I'm kind of taxed. I've been looking around my room like, and nothing's jumping out at me, so keep it fresh. But I'd be really curious to see your guys' associations, if you have questions for me about any others of mine, whatever. Just kind of want to put this out there and do something slightly different than just talk about the pile, but make something. Anyways, comics.